2025 is here, and the pace of change has never been faster. Are you ready to thrive in a world where AI accelerates everything, but can't replace the most essential human skills? That's why we've created a special 11-part series on the Learnit podcast to help you master the skills needed to future-proof yourself and your career. From self-awareness to listening and developing trust, these are the traits that will make you irreplaceable in an ever-evolving workforce. I'm Damon Lemby, CEO of Learnit and two-time best-selling author, and I'll be your guide throughout the series. Joining me is Dr. Mickey Fitzcollins, Learnit's top-ranked facilitator and a leadership expert dedicated to helping you grow. This series is brought to you in partnership with our good friends at MuchSkills, a platform that helps organizations map and understand their workforce capabilities. Drawing from insight from their survey of over 28,000 professionals, we'll unpack 11 skills in this weekly series that will prepare you to thrive in an ever-evolving world. If you enjoy this episode, please take a moment to rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us share this message far and wide. Let's dive into today's top skill. So what's the definition of coaching, and what are we really talking about when it comes to coaching?
Yeah. So coaching really is more than just kind of giving people instructions. Do this, don't do that, right? Really what you're trying to do is empower your individuals and your team really to try to get to their maximum potential. Every one of us has kind of our day-to-day performance zone. This is how I am. But what we're trying to do is kind of get people outside of that performance zone to kind of get to that bigger potential place. And so really it's about how do we guide them? How do we steer them? How do we support them? How do we help them grow to maximize that potential? Kind of moving from current performance to potential. And this is really important, Damon, because, I think when it's done right, we take people's regular performance and we turn it into maximal performance, right? And that's what, I don't know a single organization out there that's like, yeah, I want so-so employees and I want to be part of a so-so organization, right? We're all trying to grow. We're all trying to get better. And a well-coached team isn't just a good team. They're an unstoppable team, right? They are a scalable team. And what we're trying to do is move people away from this kind of old style command and control sort of thing. So I'm really excited. I have a 5-step model that I'm going to be introducing to everybody today. I'm really excited to talk about this.
No, I am as well. And I like what you say, unstoppable, right? That's where we all want to
Yeah.
get. And every leader, I think not everyone, but most of them have the right intentions and they want to do right for their team. So let's look at this from this way. What happens if we don't coach? What if we stick with we just manage people and we stick with the command and control? What will we see happening to our teams?
Yeah. And when I talk about coaching, right, people get this vision. I'm sure you get a vision in your head, right, from your baseball background of a certain type of an individual of a coach. But there's really a lot of different coaching styles. And the important piece of all of this is that we have to do what works for the person and works for the situation. Really, we're talking about kind of like situational coaching. And so some situations and some people, we need to be directive and say, okay, this is the process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes I have a really high performer, really high output. I can kind of lean back, get out of the way, let good people do their work. And other times what we want to do is we want to sit in this place of what we call non-directive coaching. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today with that framework. But if we only function as managers, as supervisors, right? This older style of command and control leadership, I think many of us probably worked in a number of different jobs that was the style of our manager. But what we know, especially over the last few years, is that workplaces are shifting, right? Employees are wanting to be able to bring their voices to the table. They're wanting to learn those critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills. They want to have chances to exact their leadership skills. And this all comes down to a thing that you and I have talked a lot about, which is employee satisfaction and employee retention. And when individual employees grow their skills, companies grow, right? So it really is in the best interest of a lot of companies as well as individuals to build out their coaching skills. Because this isn't just about doing better on the individual level. This is about doing better at the organizational level.
No, I love it. And so let's kick it off. Do you have any great coaching stories you could share with us?
Oh, you bet I do. Yeah, absolutely. I have one particular experience that I will never forget. That when I was thinking about this topic, I was like, "This is going to be perfect." I had a team member. We're going to just call him Jake. Okay, super talented, super smart, shown all the potential that you would want in an employee. But after a couple of months, I noticed that something was kind of off. His enthusiasm was kind of dipping. Deadlines were kind of going to the wayside. His performance was just not great. It was on the decline. Now, in the past, I would have just jumped in and been like, here's the solutions, right? Jake, here's the advice. Here's what you need to do. Here's deadlines. Here's this direct feedback. Instead of coming to a conversation with all the answers to him, what I did was I changed it and I came with a bunch of questions, right? When we sat down, I didn't lead with, here's all the performance metrics that you've missed or that you're not quite at or anything like that. What I did was I simply asked, how are you feeling about your work these days? And I could tell Jake was a little like, what? He wasn't totally sure what I was wanting. He was a little bit hesitant, but then he opened up. And that's when I learned there was so much more going on than I realized. It turned out that not only was Jake feeling overwhelmed, he was overwhelmed with his work, but he was also overwhelmed with some stuff going on in his personal life, right? He'd been dealing with a lot of stress outside the office, and it was certainly taking a toll for him at work. And, what surprised me about all of this was that he hadn't said anything because he didn't want me to think that he was weak or that he couldn't handle his responsibilities or anything like that. And it made me realize that, gosh, I was only being focused on outcomes with him instead of process. I was only in this directive sort of space, right? So instead of just telling Jake, oh, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to do, I shifted into this non-directive coaching style. And we really went through and had conversations, right? I asked him a lot of open-ended questions, helped him come up with solutions, asked him kind of what does he think that he wants to do. And we really kind of came together as partners rather than that kind of command control, like you need to do this, don't do this, that sort of thing. We talked through a lot of possibilities to all of the things that we're experiencing that were problematic for him. And, the thing that was cool about it was that not only did this non-directive coaching style work, he felt really empowered from that of we can have conversations about this stuff and that he didn't have to experience barriers about like telling me that he was struggling or anything, because what he really just needed was a partner to discuss solutions, to discuss some of these obstacles, right? And what happened over the next few months, Damon, was amazing. It was a huge transformation, right? He didn't just get back on track, right? He exceeded every single expectation. He became more engaged, more focused, all because I changed my style of how I was as a supervisor to him. I became a coach, right? I went from this directive outcome sort of oriented piece to a question asker, a conversation hoster, right? And that was incredibly powerful, right? That was the key to this is I had to become a coach and not just a manager.
I think that's wonderful. And a couple things I heard you say is, first of all, asking open-ended questions and really leaning in and being curious. And I think we're probably going to do another episode just on listening in general, which is so important when it comes to coaching. And earlier on, you talked about how not just jumping in and giving answers. And I think that's important, for our listeners to kind of think about who are leaders. Think about a time where you sat down with somebody and maybe you're short on time or you're stressed. Instead of having a coaching moment, you just jumped in and told somebody what to do. I think we could all relate to that. But when it comes to coaching, it's important to kind of, sometimes you have to slow down to go fast. And what I mean by that is if you just take the extra time and you ask open-ended questions and you just keep probing and you get the people to come up, your employees to come up with answers themselves, you're helping them learn how to think through things. And what that's going to do is it's going to help you be able to scale and delegate and do all this because people are starting to think even more so for themselves. And that's really what coaching is. And it's so critical. And it also gets into what we talk about with Stephen M. R. Covey in one of our great episodes is, well, one of our very best episodes is around trust. And it's unlocking the trust or creating trust, which is going to unlock the potential, the full potential that people have. So thanks for all that, Mickey. Can we just dive into the 5-step process?
Yeah, that would be awesome because this framework, and you said, sometimes people feel pinched for time. What I always tell people is these coaching conversations, they don't have to be these big, like hour-long, extravagant sort of thing. You can have I've had coaching conversations that are 5 minutes long, right? Like they don't have to be these big sort of things. So there's 5 steps to this kind of non-directive coaching model is what we'll call it, right? And the first one is about gathering data. Now, I know some of you, when you hear that phrase, gathering data, you might be like, Mickey, I am not a research. I am not a data person. That is not what I do. What I'm talking about with this is you're trying to get as much information as possible from your direct report about what's going on with them. And the question that I recommend is the one that many of us answer every single day on Facebook. What's on your mind, right? If you look at that prompt on Facebook, right, that's the question that's been on there for years and years and years now. What's on your mind? And the reason why that's so fantastic is it literally gets billions of responses every single day because it's massively open-ended. I can ask you that, you can ask me that, and the person who's on the receiving end, they get to choose about what they want to share, right? It's not, Damon, tell me the 3 things that you're focused on today. Damon, tell me what problem you're having right now, right? What's on your mind? So we're gathering data, we're gathering up a bunch of intel. Now, the second piece of this is we want to get that person kind of focused in on what exactly is the problem or what exactly is the goal, right? And the magic question that I have for this step, Damon, is what's the real challenge or what's the real problem for you? What that does is that takes all of that information and gets that person to localize in and say, this is the thing that's really going on for me, right? I might have a bunch of different situations, but this is the thing that's kind of the undercurrent of all of that. And for me as a coach, that's absolutely golden, right? Because it's not about me determining what their priority is, or it's not me saying, oh, Damon, you know what your problem is, right? We all love when somebody says that to us, right? But it's allowing them to say, this is the real issue for me, right? And again, it's keeping them, like if you use the analogy of of a car, right? It's keeping them in the driver's seat rather than you being in the driver's seat and putting them in the passenger seat, right? So that's the first 2 steps. Third step is level setting the relationship. And what I mean by that is kind of establishing like, what is it that they need from me, right? So Damon, if this was you and I having this conversation, I would say something like, Damon, what do you need from me right now? If I was going to manage this really well for you, what would I do, right? And what that does is it allows that other person to say, and this again, magic questions, allows that other person to say, well, I need you to help me come up with some ideas. Or, I just need to kind of rant a little bit. Or I have a few different ideas and I want to run them past you and see which one you think is best, right? Again, it's allowing that person to sit in the driver's seat rather than you saying, okay, so what I'm going to do for you is, right? That's that very directive sort of style. Now, the fourth step, this is where, we're starting kind of rubber meets the road and we want the person to determine what the possible solutions are, right? So we're asking questions like, what are you thinking about doing? What are potential solutions? But the real magic question in this step is what obstacles are you thinking about that you might encounter? Because all of us, right, when we go into a critical thinking situation, problem solving, decision making, we think, oh, everything's going to be golden. We're not going to encounter any problems. There's going to be no issues with deadlines or resources, right? And so when we ask that question, what obstacles do you think might come up? Not only is that allowing that person to think about those solutions, but it's also being realistic about, let's talk about obstacles that might come in. Now, the fifth step, Damon, and probably what I would say is the most important step with all of this is the loop closer, the check-in. What we've done in the last step is we're trying to get that person to the very end, kind of saying like, this is what I'm going to do and by when. And we need to make sure to follow up on this because it's not enough for us to be like, okay, sounds good. Sounds like you have a good plan, right? We need to close the loop on that. And there's a number of different ways, right? We can just ask like, how did it go? But I love asking questions like, what would you do similarly next time? What would you do differently next time? Because think about our work. It's very cyclical in nature. Regardless of what type of role, regardless of what type of industry, we do a lot of cyclical pattern sort of things. And so again, what we're doing is we're engaging those critical thinking skills and those problem solving skills to think about, okay, well, I hadn't really thought about what I would do differently next time. And now you're encouraging them to do that. You can also ask questions too, Damon, like, what could I do to support you better in the future, right? And again, these 5 steps, this doesn't have to be an hour-long conversation. It can be a 5-minute conversation, but it's really powerful stuff.
That's all great. And I love the magic questions. So, Mickey, I got a couple questions here for you. So one is, so if you ask them, what is the real challenge or problem that comes up? And the answer that they give you is blatantly just incorrect. How do you solve like if so? Basically, what I'm saying is, it's apparent that they're looking to solve the wrong problem. how do you address that through coaching instead of just telling them, well, actually, you're wrong. It's actually this.
Yeah, and so this is the thing that's really great about coaching is that we can oscillate back and forth between these different styles. What I just kind of walked you through is this kind of non-directive. It's based in kind of facilitating question or facilitating conversation by asking open-ended questions. There are times, right? And you know this, I know this. There are times where we do need to shift into that directive sort of role of, nope, here's this thing, here's this metric, this deadline, this process, this outcome, whatever it might be. And we do need to be directive about there's a missed mark here or we're not focused on the right thing, right? And we can shift in and out of those pieces. And so, I think in those situations where I've had somebody say, oh, well, the real issue is this, right? Maybe they're pushing blame off on somebody else, or the real issue is this thing that's completely outside of anybody's control, right? Um, what I tend to do is like, okay, let's bring this back in a little bit, right? And I might take that little bit more of a directive tone. Let's bring this back in a little bit to things that are within our of control. What's the real issue for you in terms of things that you have influence or control over? Because that takes that huge field, right, of all the things I could be thinking about. And okay, well, hang on a second here. The real issue is my ability to effectively manage my time, or the real issue is not having enough resources for this project, right? It's not the economy or leadership or something like that. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
And the other thing I want to point out there too is you narrowing it down, right? So if somebody just says, you know, I'm angry. Okay, well, what are you angry about? Right. So it's not or if they say it's the economy or I'm just frustrated, it's kind of narrowing it down to really understand so they can elaborate on it from there. And step five, closing the loop, it kind of sounds like feedback, right? Because you're giving a little bit of feedback, but you're also asking them like, okay, but you're not, I guess in a sense is you're not really giving them feedback. You're asking them what did go well here, or what could we have done differently, or what do you think we could have done differently?
Yeah, coaching to me, a big differentiator between just being a manager and just being a supervisor is coaching has a reflection component to it, right? What we're trying to teach is the skill of reflection. And so after you've solved a problem, you've completed a project, whatever it is, teaching that person, okay, let's engage in this. Some people might call it a postmortem or an after action, report or something like that, but let's engage in some reflection so that we're learning from things so that next time we are better, we are stronger, right? And it's not just, oh my gosh, why did this same, outcome, right? There's that Einstein quote about insanity. The definition of an insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. If we don't reflect on what we do, we're not going to see the learning moments in there. And that's such a essence portion of coaching for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind for me is I talk about this in my book, The Learn It All Leader. Don't don't be a hero. As a sales leader, especially, you'll see a lot of sales leaders who accompany their sales reps on sales calls, either virtually or in person. And Mickey, what they do is they just jump in and take over the call, right? Right off the bat, they jump in, they take over the call, and then let's say the call goes really well and they win close the deal. Well, that's being a hero because what happens then is the person you're accompanying, supporting, you're not helping them with their career development, right? Essentially what you're doing is you're just taking over, and they're just taking a back seat. Where instead, and I learned this from Mike Weinberg in his book New Sales Simplified, is instead what you do, and I've always tried to do this, is when I walk out of a meeting, and this is why I love the in person stuff for all you sales leaders out there and sales reps, if you get an opportunity to travel with them in a car or be able to have lunch before and after, it's just like, hey, what do you think went well? What
Yeah.
can we do
The
differently?
debrief.
Yeah,
Yep.
a debrief. And it's like, in this situation, you ask these questions. What are some different questions you could have asked? Or,
Yeah.
what do you think really resonated with the customer? There's so many great ways there to extract the information where you're getting your person again to think through things. And I think that that's so critical. But I have a different question for you as well. And I get asked this a lot. I want to make sure I get this in. What is the difference between coaching somebody and mentoring somebody?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think people use those words kind of interchangeably, and depending on the organization you're part of or the industry you're part of, I could see there being some interchange there. The big difference is for me, mentoring typically is somebody who's kind of a more senior level employee or senior level leader, kind of taking a more junior level person under their wing, not necessarily in that supervisory hierarchical sort of way, right? Like this is my direct report. But mentoring really is kind of that taking an interest, helping somebody know, here's what you need to do to be successful in this organization. Here's how I can help you open up some doors. Here's the things that you need to do to be really successful in our industry. Here's news for you to pay attention to, right? This idea of kind of, I think about people that I would name as mentors, people that help you kind of grow up and grow into a role in a field in an industry, right? Coaching is much more of what we do or what we should do or what we ought to be doing in that manager direct report sort of relationship, right? Which is kind of helping. This is my assigned role hierarchically in the organization, right? Is like my assigned role is to manage this person or supervise this person. Um, but the difference there is that I'm there to help them meet the business objectives, right? To help them meet the business goals, right? So there's a very specific charge to that relationship. Fine line differences, right? I think some people might say, well, Mickey, I have a coach that I hired from the outside, right? An executive coach or something. Absolutely, totally get that. And I've done the same thing myself. Um, but that's a little bit different than what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is here's my supervisor who functions in this coaching, style sort of way within the organization. Yeah.
No, that's a great answer because yeah, a mentor is somebody who maybe helps you inspire or helps you build a career plan. Where a coach is really coaching towards business objectives, right, and outcomes and goals. They're just doing it in a way that's not command and control.
Yeah. Damon, I have a question for you if you don't mind me turning the tables a little bit for you.
Sure.
Thinking about, you have so many years experience at Learnit and you've worked with so many different people. And there's all these different ways in which we can lead other people. How do you one of the challenges I've had throughout the years is, I have a preference in terms of how I like to lead other people, and I have a preference for how I like to be led. But what I've learned over the years is neither one of those things matters except for what the person in front of me needs and wants in that situation. So how do you or how have you kind of negotiated that? Like, this is how I like to supervise. This is how I like to be supervised. And maybe there's this third other thing, which is the person in the situation right in front of you. How do you negotiate that stuff?
Well, I think that that's a fantastic question because yeah, we have our styles that are comfortable for us, like how we like to lead and or how we like to coach. And a lot of times I think what happens is we look at it from like what works for us, how coaches have worked for us and how do we adapt well to it. When the truth of the matter is, I think great leaders are able to lead and coach based off what works for people on an individual level because everybody, Mickey, is different, whether it's how you give and receive feedback, whether it's how you support somebody, everybody's different. And I really like what Ethan Evans spoke about in the episode on the Learn It All podcast, where he kind of called, I've never heard this, he called it chameleon
Yeah.
leadership,
Yep.
where it's like, he says that great leaders adapt to the strengths of the people on their team. So they adjust their coaching style in the situation to whatever's going to work best for individuals. And I've had situations in the past where maybe I wasn't self-aware enough and I kept trying to coach somebody a specific way and it just
Mm,
never caught on, right? And I would get frustrated, they would get frustrated until I realized that maybe my form of communication or maybe the way I went around about it or the way I asked the questions, it just didn't work. And so you had to kind of adjust and either maybe ask them, hey, this isn't working. What can I do to, coach you better or differently? And if you have a good enough relationship, they'll feel comfortable telling you, or you just gotta iterate on what you're doing and adjust and see if progress is being made, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, it does, and it's funny because I was thinking about that chameleon concept from Ethan, right? Of that, just anybody who's ever seen lizards of any type, right, and how they just blend right in, and I think that's so hard for us as leaders sometimes, and especially the more and more seasoning that we have, so to speak, right? That we think, oh well, this is my leadership style, right? This is I hear people say this sometimes in our workshops, right? Is this is my leadership style. This is how I lead my team. And that's always, I wouldn't call it a red flag, but it's like a yellow flag to me because you don't have a whole bunch of replicas of you on that team, right? Like we have diverse teams. That's what makes them so powerful. But it's so dangerous for us if we don't adapt that chameleon style, as Ethan Evans said. Absolutely. Yeah.
What's important you said right there is I found that you got to be great leaders are, a servant leadership. You put your people first, right?
Mm.
You put your people first. And that means it's not about you as a leader, it's about your people. So in order to make it about your people, you need to lead in a way that works for them, and that will gain results. Now, we're almost wrapping up on time, but I do have, I think what's an interesting and important question is when it comes to coaching, do you coach, Mickey, what's your thoughts around, do you coach to people's strengths or do you coach to focus on their weaknesses?
Yeah, strengths absolutely. And the thing about it is when you coach to somebody's strengths, what you're doing is you're building up what's already good in them, right? And we all, I mean, a basic human need outside of food, shelter, water, that sort of stuff is we have the need to be seen and to be recognized. Like that is a basic human need, right? And when we coach to people's strengths, what we're doing is we're saying, here's what I already see that's good and valuable. Here's what I already see that's really helping to contribute to our team and our organization. When we start building that and building, the rest of the stuff, right? It's like a buoy in the water, right? It will float those areas of needed improvement will get better and better, right? Because that person is going to feel more engaged, they're going to feel more satisfied, they're going to be feeling more motivated, there's going to be trust, psychological safety, all those good ingredients of what we want to have in the employee experience, which is going to make space for us talking about those areas that we need to get better at, right? We all have them, but when I know that somebody is seeing and valuing and building up those things that are strengths of mine, I'm much more willing to work on those things that I need to improve on. Absolutely. I think one of the things there's a little asterisk that I would put next to that, Damon, which is if somebody has some people call them weakness. I like areas of needed improvement. But if somebody's doing something that they are absolutely making the wrong decision, it's going to be detrimental to the business or the organization. It's kind of that, watching the train that's about to wreck sort of thing. If there's something happening that is absolutely going to detrimentally affect the organization, I will step in with that kind of directive sort of feedback. And that will be coaching around that issue of concern or that issue of weakness or an area of needed improvement in a directive sort of way, right? Because ultimately we have to protect the business. We have to protect the goals that we're trying to achieve, but definitely coaching to strengths.
No, I'm with you 100%. I think that focusing on individual strengths you get a lot more bang for the buck. You're going to, instead of trying to push a rock up the hill on the weaknesses, focus on the strengths. And because I think at a young age, even if you look at like uh, kids, report cards in school, if you get four A's and a C, everybody always just looks at the C, right? And when maybe you should focus on what they're doing well and continue to make those better. And with that being said, if there's something that they're doing that's either going to prevent them from to being fired or it's just blatantly, a weakness that's hurting the business, you have to address that, right? Because if you don't, whatever strengths they have may be outweighed by weaknesses, and at that point, they just may need to go. Now, so Mickey, we're at time here. Um, we have time if you have one last tip for the audience around coaching that you want to share, and maybe talk a little bit about the Learnit coaching class.
So yes, Damon, I would actually call it a call to action, which is I want everybody who's listening to this and watching this, I want you to start your next conversation with any one of your direct reports with that magic question of what's on your mind. And the reason for that is because it is so open-ended and it's going to allow you to put your supervisee in the driver's seat to that conversation. Try that out, see what that's like as you kind of move through this week, next week, anything like that. And see how that changes the nature of your conversations. I have seen that myself personally. It just dramatically changes the nature of those conversations, and it is deposits in the trust bank, right? What it does is it changes the hierarchy, the power relationship to two people that are having a trusting relationship around trying to fulfill the goals of the business, right? You mentioned our Coach Your Team workshop, and I'm so fortunate. I facilitate that workshop very, very regularly. It's one of our most popular workshops because I think people are so keen to this idea of coaching. And we dig into a lot of this stuff in a much greater lens and kind of do a lot of practice with that. But it's really oriented around this idea, as you said before, strengths-based coaching, right? What we can do to help take people, again, if you think about two circles, right? Our day-to-day performance to our potential zone, right? Like, what are we all doing? And that's what we should really be thinking about. What are we all doing to try to move away from just day-to-day performance to potential? Because that's where that unstoppable nature comes from with our teams.
That's wonderful. And Mickey, we've had an amazing conversation. Just to kind of recap a little bit about what we talked about, was we talked about Learnit's 5-step approach to coaching, which is non-directive coaching. I really like magic questions. That's awesome. And it's important as a leader to not do the command and control and jump in and answer questions and tell people what to do. It's to have patience and really listen and ask those questions.
Mhm.
And focusing on strengths over weaknesses is another big important thing to remember. So for all our listeners out there today, I hope you really enjoyed our conversation. If you did, please do us a favor, rate and review the Learn It All podcast. It allows us to create more great content and get it in front of people. And also check out our Coaching for Teams class that we have. We'll have a link to that in the show notes. And until next time, everybody, stay curious and keep learning. Have a great day.
There's teamwork, and then there's collaboration. Collaboration is really where we are leaning into other people's strengths, leaning into other people's perspectives, right? Making sure that we're not just pursuing one line of thoughts to whatever the project or the task is. I think the secret sauce to collaboration is around energy and synergy.